Alright, so this week's lecture is about content management systems, and specifically the one that we're going to be using, which is WordPress, and just starting to look at WordPress theme development. Now, if you're in the class yesterday, you've already started looking at that, so hopefully what you see in this lecture will complement that and make what you started on yesterday make a bit more sense. So first, a quick recap from what we looked at last week. So last week we looked at the history of web design and the evolution of web design and the internet in general. And the trends that we identified were that websites, as we progress, they have more content and more frequently updated content and from multiple sources. So we have multiple different contributors, so there's very few websites where there's just one person or one role involved with creating the website. Now there's sort of a whole network of different people with different particular sub-skills, as well as including content from the users as well. So all of that leads us to a World Wide Web that's moving away from creating static websites towards creating dynamic websites. So if you remember this slide, this is the diagram representing the difference between those two models. So this is very fundamentally important when it comes to understanding how a dynamic website operates differently to a static website. So on the left, we have the static website where essentially each logical page maps to a file on the web server. And so if you're requesting a web page, you're requesting a single file, that file sent back and then rendered in the web browser. On the other hand, on the right with the dynamic website, your pages aren't stored as necessarily mapped one-to-one files on the web server. Your data is generally stored in a database, and we use a web scripting language, for example PHP, which goes and, based on the request that's made from the web browser, will go and find data in the database and then combine that with some HTML and other markup, and then create sort of a temporary web page that only exists for that point in time that you've requested it, and send that to the browser. So this gives us a lot more scope for creating websites that are highly customizable and interactive and so forth. So just again a quick recap. Static websites aren't completely thrown out the door. There are still some advantages to creating purely static websites. There's lower entry barrier for development, simple hosting requirements, easily cacheable, can be viewed offline, and if the project suits, then often that can be the quicker, more cost-effective route. Okay, but there are many drawbacks to using static websites if you're trying to apply them to a project that is really unsuitable. So those being, there's much less scope for interactivity, customization and personalization, and every little change or update that you do needs to be done manually. So for example, if you need to change a menu link on all of the pages in the header, you have to go through every single page in the website and change it manually, whereas if you had done it dynamically, you can make it so that it updates automatically. And going back to the fact that we have multiple content contributors, you end up having version control issues if multiple people are trying to edit the same pages at the same time. Then you'll end up overriding each other's changes and you'll just end up with a big mess. Okay, so dynamic website, as we've already discussed, the website content is stored in a database and it's assembled with markup and output by a web server script. And in our case, that will be PHP. And the advantages of dynamic websites: content can be updated in a decentralized way. So no longer is there this concept of a single webmaster who has sole responsibility or authority over creating the content for a website. Modularization and reuse of common code. So basically solving that issue with static websites where if we've got repeated code everywhere, we can basically have one dynamic version of that bit of code and update that once rather than having to go and update every static page. And we can automate things. So for example, we can automate, if we create different users for our site on a static website, if we wanted to have any sort of user system, that would have to be done manually. But we can have on a dynamic website something like a create user form where they enter their own username and password, hit a button, and the process of setting up a user account is completely automated. So some disadvantages of dynamic websites. There is a higher entry barrier or learning curve for development. There's a couple more technologies that we have to look at developing and adding to our skill set. There's slightly more complex web server requirements. So we require software to run that web scripting language on our web server, and we require a database also on our web server. There's some issues with pages being indexed by a search engine due to the fact that each page in a site doesn't necessarily exist as a file that can just be read through on the hard drive of the web server. But overall, in the majority of projects these days, the benefits of using a dynamic approach to web design far outweigh the disadvantages. Okay, so that was our recap. Now we'll start looking at exactly what are content management systems, and specifically in terms of what we're looking at, we'll say they're web content management systems, because strictly speaking we can have content management systems that manage content that's not on the web. But from this point in, really, I'll be using those terms interchangeably. So when I refer to a CMS from here on in, I'm referring to a web content management system. So we've got sort of a loose definition here of a CMS is basically a series of interfaces for performing common tasks by various users of a dynamic website. And then there's a bit longer official definition there, which you can read through and look into if you want to follow that link yourself. But what we're interested in mainly is why should we use a CMS. So the advantages of using a CMS: it makes managing lots of constantly updated content manageable. And when we talk about content management, what kinds of management are we talking about? So we're looking at things like updating, publishing and unpublishing of content, archiving, searching, moderation, and automation and securing of the content. Automation of processes, rather. Now, by providing administration interfaces, it allows people with essentially no or little understanding of web architecture to become content publishers. So the idea being we can sort of shield anyone who wants to be strictly a content producer, let's say on a site where, let's say it's a news site. If someone wants to write a news article on a static website, either they'd have to sort of learn the skills in order to update the HTML files themselves, or they'd have to write the content, pass that on to someone else who had that ability, and then again the files would be manually updated. So, but with a CMS, what we can do is we can actually create some administration interfaces for the CMS, and we'll talk more about that later, which essentially allows a content producer to use a graphical interface in order to add content to the website without ever really having to touch any of the underlying code. And of course, these contributors can be both internal and external. So as well as having sort of contributors from within the website, we can have contributors from without the website. So things like commenting on posts, users can do that, and that's done in a completely automated way. They don't necessarily have to be sent in as like a letter to the editor and then published. They can just be commented on the article straight away. We can have different user level access. So in any website, we probably want certain users to not necessarily have full reign over modifying the website. So for someone who's purely a content producer, like the person who just wants to add a news article, there's not necessarily any really reason to give them the ability to, let's say, change the layout and the look and the underlying architecture of the site. So we can create users with different levels of access to the site to basically protect the site from being messed with, usually naively and accidentally by people who may not necessarily know what they're doing there. And as we've mentioned before, we can have automation of processes. So things like adding comments, they can just be done automatically by the system. You can do things like pre-write drafts of articles and set them to be released at certain dates, and then just set that and not have to worry about it, and then when that date ticks around, it will be automatically published, all of that sort of thing. So a lot of different processes that can be automated there. Things like automatic updates to the site, you could include in that as well. And the final point is that the common architecture means development of reusable plugins, templates, and themes, etc. Okay, so if again we're taking the example of WordPress, there's many people who use WordPress as the platform for their website. So what that means is if one person creates a theme or a plugin that works with the WordPress architecture, then that will generally work for everyone else who's also using WordPress as their platform. So that allows for a community to develop around creating themes and plugins that will work across all installations of your CMS. Okay, so again, we can't really ignore that there are some disadvantages of using a CMS, and a lot of these are the same disadvantages that come with any sort of dynamic website. So, of course, they're a bit more complicated to set up. You're not just creating an HTML and CSS file and then uploading that to the web server. You have to set up databases, go through installation processes, and so forth. Now, to say it's more complicated doesn't necessarily mean it's incredibly more complicated. These processes are still fairly streamlined, and you'll see as we go through those processes in the tutorials that really, when I say complicated, it's a relative term there. The level of technical knowledge required for developer and designer is increased. So even if you sort of end up going down the path where you still remain really a fairly graphical or visual interface design part of a website, in order to inform some of your decisions of making that design, as a designer, you still really need to know a little bit about how the site works in order to create the most effective design for that. And these will be different for every CMS and often difficult to determine definitively until you've had a look at that CMS and see how it works. With CMSs, there's a one-size-fits-most approach. Okay, so the idea is that they will support a range of different types of websites. So there's sort of a balancing act between creating something that's generic enough that it supports a lot of different types of websites, but also not too overly complex in that it's difficult to create any one particular type. So some of the issues that come out of that is that any out-of-the-box or one-size-fits-most solution will force you into a certain way of doing things. So you may have developed certain processes and techniques that won't necessarily work with a particular CMS because it has a certain philosophy of the way that you need to organize content or create templates or so forth. Many CMSs are extendable and customizable, but even these processes follow certain models and conventions. So again, that really goes to the creating of templates. If there's a templating engine, they're usually slightly different for each different CMS, and so you have to kind of learn what that is and then stick to that fairly strictly. So the last point says, at what point does it make more sense to build your own CMS from scratch? So as I said, they're kind of designed to fit a lot of different solutions, but particularly if you have a very unique or specialized website that maybe they haven't envisaged supporting, then it can be, using a CMS for that or an off-the-shelf CMS can be like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. You can get to the point where you're trying to make it do things that it is not necessarily designed to do. So at that point, you may decide that it's actually more efficient for you to just create your own content management system, which is done quite often, and there's nothing wrong with that. Okay, so some other points. Upgrading the underlying technologies of the CMS may be difficult or impossible, especially if you've customized the core code. So there's issues with upgrading. Certain CMSs are better and worse at that sort of thing. So you might create a website in version 1 of a CMS, and then they might decide to fundamentally overhaul the architecture of the CMS. And when they release version 2, you find that if you upgrade the core CMS engine to version 2, that a whole heap of your version 1 code doesn't work anymore. Now I guess that's something that as CMSs have matured, the developers have become more aware of, and I guess it's becoming a little bit less of an issue, but it is still something to keep in mind. The next point's a fairly big one. Migrating content to a different CMS may be difficult or impossible. I guess impossible is a bit too strong a word, maybe unfeasible. So again, this goes with a CMS will have a certain philosophy of how it stores data in the database and how the whole thing works together. So it's not necessarily going to be straightforward from pulling all the content out of your website when in one CMS, and if you decide to change to a different one, that can be a fairly painful process. And in a rapidly evolving website, how do we know if the current solution, the current CMS that we've chosen will still be the best one in a month from now, a year from now, or 10 years from now? And that's a really difficult question to answer. And I guess that comes down to you just have to do your research, do your analysis, and try and make your best guess as to whether this solution will be an effective long-term solution. Okay, and the last point there is there's some issues that aren't such a big deal anymore due to search engine optimization, but really that's related mostly to any dynamic websites, not strictly just a CMS thing. Okay, so let's look at some common web CMS features. We have things like automated templates, easily editable content, as we've mentioned, scalable feature sets. So usually you can you get sort of a core functionality, and then you can extend that functionality, usually with plugins. You have web standards upgrades. So as sort of web technologies progress, they're usually implemented into new upgrades of the core CMS as well. You have workflow management, so things like I mentioned before, where you can create drafts of posts and then decide to release them later. You can assign different users to different content sections of the site and so forth. And I guess that comes under delegation. Document management in any CMS, of course, so you've got interfaces for you to basically list all of the content on your site and edit and modify it that way. And content virtualization. So taking content that's in the database, and again, there's a bit of a crossover with dynamic websites in general. There's no specific set way you need to display that content. You can combine bits of content from different parts of the site into a new page and all that sort of thing. So quite powerful functionality. So content management confusion. How many CMSs exist? The answer to that is heaps, and some would say too many. I've got a link there, which I won't necessarily go into here, but if you have a look at that, there is a list of possibly, there may even be hundreds of them. And why are there so many? Basically because everyone develops their own. They think it's the best. Or if there's one that someone's used and it doesn't quite fit the type of website that they want, they'll go and create a new one which they feel fits that methodology better. So the fact that there's so many, how do we choose which CMS is best? So there's a few things that you need to consider when choosing a CMS for your website. First of all, this is assuming that you've already determined that a CMS is suitable for your website. So you need to look at your needs and your technical knowledge. So obviously if there's a CMS that uses sort of knowledge and technologies that you already understand, then that's going to allow you to develop quicker with it. There's also client needs, so how the client needs the content to be managed, their costs and their time frames. But I guess most importantly, what you should look at is what the site wants. Okay, so the site and the content of the site is going to be a certain way, and there should be a CMS that matches closely enough the way that you want to run that site. And the more specialized and unique your site is, I guess the more you're going to need to research into what CMS is going to be the best for you. And then there's various CMS options, okay, so things like licensing, development team, security, accessibility and code quality, documentation, it's a very big one, and training and support. I've looked at CMSs that are really powerful and have great feature sets, but if the documentation is terrible, then it's going to take you a lot longer to learn how to use that than if it had really good documentation. So, of course, there's a lot of free CMSs, a lot of free and open source CMSs, but there's also plenty of commercial ones. So again, that's another thing to take into account. Commercial ones are obviously going to cost money, but if that commercial one suits your website a lot better, then it may be more cost effective in the long run. Okay, now there are certain times where it's not really beneficial anyway to use a CMS. So there are a lot of people who are trying to convince you, if you're starting up a website, that CMS is always the way to go. Okay, but don't believe the hype. It's not always the case. We've already seen that there's more factors involved in setting up CMS than a static website. So if you do have a website that you know for a fact is never going to change very often, only has a few pages, then there's really no benefit to setting up a CMS. If you're never going to use the features of CMS, then why go through that extra process of installing it, configuring it, possibly paying more for your web hosting to have those features? So don't just go in with the assumption that you should always use a CMS. And of course, if the design and or architecture of your website is highly unique or specialized, then attempting to make it work with an out-of-box solution, as I said before, can often just make it end up taking longer and be more costly. Okay, so looking at the requirements from your website, you want to look at the requirements from a design perspective, from an economic perspective, and from a technological compatibility perspective. And you want to look at these questions and you want to be able to answer them to the best of your ability and what these requirements are going to be now and down the track in a month, a year, in 10 years. Websites evolve rapidly, and one thing that people often, a mistake that people often make is assuming that their vision for their website right now is going to be largely the same to move down the track. But if you're doing it for a business and that business rapidly expands or decides to add new features to the site, then you might decide on a CMS that suits a much smaller site, and then in a month or a year's time you need to go and completely overhaul the site because that's no longer suits what the site actually requires. So how do we figure out which CMS solution best meets these requirements? Basically, you just research as much as time permits. You obviously aren't going to be able to look at every single CMS that's ever been invented, but you can read reviews, you can look at other similar websites to the ones that you're trying to create and look at what CMSs they're using, see if it seems to be suiting that style of website well. But one good thing that you can do is there's a link down the bottom of this slide to opensourcecms.com, which is actually a really handy site, which I might just quickly open it up and have a look. Okay, so this is a website which is actually dedicated to having a whole bunch of different open source CMSs installed, and it allows you to have basically guest login access to them, so you can navigate around, see what the interfaces look like, see what the content publishing looks like, and see what the front end looks like, theming templates, all the different features. Will let you play around with a bunch of them, and that's a really good way of getting a quick idea of whether or not it might suit the project that you're working on. So I'll let you have a look through that in your own time if you want, but that's really quite a useful tool for the initial stages of deciding which CMS you might want to use. So this next slide, I have a bit of a graph here where I've picked 3 of the more popular open source PHP MySQL based CMSs here: WordPress, Joomla, and Drupal, and I've graphed them on a very simple graph, basically to show that if you're looking at the gamut of CMSs, generally as the complexity or the range of features that you can implement in your website with a certain CMS, as that increases, so the versatility of the CMS, as that increases, you generally find the complexity and the time that it takes you to sort of learn how to use it and get into developing for it increases as well. And that's completely understandable. It's just like any application. The more versatile it is, generally, the more complex the interface has to be and so forth. I guess the way I've laid it out is possibly a little bit misleading. I'm not necessarily implying that WordPress has extremely low versatility and Drupal has extremely high versatility. The scale's probably not that. It's much more compressed than that. But as a general sort of trend, this is where they kind of sit. So there maybe, if you were looking at another web project, there may be another 2 of using similar architectures to WordPress that you might want to consider looking at if you're looking at a site which needs even more functionality than WordPress. So basically, we've taken that step of choosing the CMS out of the process for your first assignment for you, when we've said, basically, we're going to get you to use WordPress. So why are we going to use WordPress? Basically, because it's on the sort of lower end of the complexity scale of getting into, then it's a good one to sort of ease you into the world of content management systems. It's relatively simple, but its functionality can be expanded greatly with a little extra work. So things like plugins and themes and templates and so forth again, don't necessarily take from this slide that WordPress is an underpowered CMS. You can actually make it very powerful, and it does power a lot of quite large websites. It's free and open source, which is always nice. It's very popular, so there's a big community around it, which means there's a lot of plugins and a lot of themes developed for it. It has excellent documentation. That's probably one of the biggest reasons why we're choosing it, because we're just starting out with CMSs, we're learning, then we want a lot of help, and as much hand-holding as we can along the way. And good documentation is always helpful for that. And again, because it's popular, there's plenty of good third-party tutorials. It has a few years behind it now, so it's got a good track record and it's being actively developed, so it probably isn't going to go away anytime soon. If you create a WordPress website now, then it's unlikely that that company's not going to exist next year and they're going to stop updating the WordPress engine. It has a good track record of upgrading to new features without breaking the old ones, which is really it's something that you don't necessarily consider starting out, but as soon as you have to do that down the track, if you've ever had to go through that process of upgrading to a new version, having to completely overhaul the site, you'll appreciate a CMS that upgrades gracefully without breaking stuff on your current site. And the last point being that it runs on the very common AMP server structure, which is Apache, MySQL, and PHP, basically the technologies that will run on the web server in order to run the WordPress software. So a little bit of history about WordPress. It started off as a blogging tool, and if you ask most people today what is WordPress, they would probably say it's a blogging tool. But it has developed into a very powerful, or quite powerful CMS. So brief history, its roots and development date back to 2001. In 2005, version 1.5 was released, which introduced, I guess, the most fundamental extra CMS-y features, and including themes. And WordPress.com started with its own online hosting. So basically, WordPress is equivalent to Tumblr or Blogger or any of those other online blogging sites. And so by 2007, obviously it was very popular. Okay, a lot of downloads and a lot of plugins developed, and those numbers will just be even bigger now. So a lot of people will try and claim that WordPress isn't a CMS. And strictly speaking, anything that has any content management features is a CMS. I guess there's no strict definition of what constitutes a CMS and what doesn't. But I guess people's criticism of WordPress is usually when they compare it to something else and it just has a few less features. But really, there's not a lot of justification behind that. So this next slide is, does WordPress plugins equal a CMS? There's a lot of sites, a lot of tutorials you can look at which basically have posts on how do you turn WordPress into a fully fledged CMS. And there's a list of plugins, a few of them which you can see here, which are designed to do exactly that, to add some of the features that exist in more complex CMSs to WordPress through the use of plugins. So you've got things like customization plugins, so you can hide certain parts of the interface from various people if you want. All the way down to things like contact forms, modifying user permissions. There's even e-commerce plugins for WordPress, so you can set up an online store using WordPress, and just about anything you can imagine. If someone's had the need for it, then there's a good chance that someone's created a plugin for it. And so there's a link down the bottom to one of these articles in that sort of vein, how to turn WordPress into a CMS website. So this is just one example of a plugin. Someone obviously created a client site where they wanted to brand the login page. That functionality didn't exist in the core WordPress, so they created a plugin to allow you to do that. And a big point, again, dispelling this sort of myth that WordPress is purely just a blogging tool, is that WordPress sites don't have to look like blogs. So there's no doubt that WordPress did start as a blogging tool, but it's evolved through, they're up to their third major iteration, and each time it becomes a more and more powerful CMS. So there are many websites built on WordPress that you just wouldn't consider blogs. You probably look at it and you wouldn't even think that it was made in WordPress. So here's a couple of examples. Flickout.com, this is a movie website, I believe. This is, I think, a portfolio website. So again, to the first appearance, it doesn't look like a blog at all. So basically, we can take the same philosophies behind a blogging tool, and really, if you strip it all the way back, a post is really, you can make a post any kind of content. It doesn't necessarily have to be a blog post. So the content's there in the database. Using the theming and templates, we can arrange that content really in any way that we want. And here's a whole bunch of other links to some different articles which aggregate a bunch of different websites that don't look like blogs. So I'd recommend having a look through some of those, mainly as an early stage of your process, to look at the kind of things. If you're unsure, if you've got an idea in your head of how you want your website to look and you're unsure if that's going to be something that WordPress can easily do, then have a look at some of these websites and see the kind of things that they can do which you wouldn't necessarily associate with a blogging site. Okay, so we'll look now at some of the technical stuff about WordPress and setting up WordPress. First of all, the server requirements. So as of WordPress 3.2, the requirements for your web server, which you can find at that link, are basically you need PHP version 5.2.4 or greater, MySQL version 5.0 or greater, and the Apache web server is the one that they recommend, although it will work on any web server that has, or should work on any web server that has PHP and MySQL. So this, as I mentioned before, the LAMP server technology, this is what we call the LAMP server stack. Now, this isn't necessarily important stuff that you have to remember these terms, but just because you'll probably see this used a lot, I thought I'd just explain a bit what it means. So you'll see probably the acronym LAMP used a lot, and that stands for Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP, which is basically just all the software that's running. I guess that's the most common configuration running on a web server, and all that stuff is required for you to basically host your website and host your WordPress site. So on this diagram, I guess this is what it looks like. If this is you with your computer, then you make a request to the web server. The web server is in terms of hardware, it's just a computer running some software with a network interface that accepts connections and then does it all it needs to do in order to give you back the web content that you've requested. So on that web server, we have these different software running. Okay, we have the Apache HTTP server, and its job is really just to take the URL that you've requested and figure out basically either what file or what information to deliver back to you. And then, of course, PHP is running on top of that. Okay, so WordPress is coded in PHP, so it needs the PHP engine installed on the web server to run. And then, of course, it needs MySQL, the MySQL engine as well to run, so that we can create databases and access the information out of that. So it's not really necessary that you remember that architecture, but just so you know what it is when you see that term, that's basically what the acronym stands for. It's a different software that runs on the web server. There's a link down the bottom if you want to look into that in a bit more detail. Okay, so how do we go about installing WordPress on your remote web server? The first link is a link to a very detailed documentation on how we do that in various different scenarios, so that's definitely worth a look. But I'll just talk about it in a fairly high level. I guess there's 4 main steps. First one, you need to download the WordPress package, okay, the WordPress engine, and upload that to your web server using an FTP client. Second, you need to create a MySQL database on your web server that the WordPress installation is going to use to store all of its content. Thirdly, you need to edit a config file in the WordPress installation, basically to point WordPress to the database that you've created. And then you create an administrator account and start using WordPress. So it's a fairly straightforward installation process. And once you've done it once, you'll be able to do it 100 times again really quite easily. So to go into that in a little more detail, firstly installing the WordPress package. Obviously you're going to need to download it. You can download the latest release at that URL there. It'll download a zip file, you'll need to extract it, and it will extract to a folder called WordPress, which has a bunch of files in it. And all these files are the core WordPress engine, which we then add extra features to. But this folder is the files that need to go onto your web server in order to run WordPress. Then we need to upload that directory to the web server. Now on your web server you'll have a certain directory which is designed to store your publicly accessible website files. On a Unix web server that's almost always called public_HTML. You may find that it's called www or something like that. But if it's different to this, it should be in that setup email that you get from the web hosting. They should tell you the directory where you need to put your website files. But basically you need to upload using FTP client that WordPress folder that you extracted to your public HTML directory. Now if you only want the one website to be on your web server, then you'll probably upload the contents of that directory, WordPress directory, directly to the public HTML folder so that you can so that when you go to the URL, it opens up the WordPress site. If we upload the whole WordPress folder, you'll have to go to your URL and then / the folder name WordPress. So you can upload it in different ways, but we'll look at that in more detail in class. So once you've done that, you need to create the database. Now when you set up your web hosting, you should be given, as part of that, again, setup email, that you get a URL and login details to a web hosting control panel, such as cPanel. cPanel is a very popular one, again, on a Unix web server. And this interface is basically designed to allow you to configure your web server in a graphical interface. And you can do many things with it. It'd be worth looking at cPanel just in general if you want to see the different things that you can configure on your web server. You'll probably have to use that in order to get your domain pointing to your website, that sort of stuff as well. But what we're interested in is its ability to create and manage databases. So the cPanel, we open that up, and we need to create a database. This link at the bottom here is a video tutorial, which the screen captures on the next few slides are taken from. So on most of these control panels, they should have pretty good documentation, and cPanel usually has a lot of good video tutorials. So while it may seem daunting at first, the processes are usually very clearly explained. So this is the process, for example, of setting up a MySQL database using cPanel. So this is after I've gone to my URL, which might be, in my case, it's my website URL and then /cPanel. But again, that should be in your setup email. So I've gone to there, I've logged in with the username and password that they gave me in the setup email, and then I'm presented with this interface, which gives me a bunch of different options to administer my web server. The one I'm interested in is the MySQL databases, so I click on that, and then basically when you're creating a MySQL database, you need to give it a name. So that's pretty straightforward. You type in a name and click Create Database. But what you also need to do is you need to create a database user for this database. So just like anything else that needs to be secured, you should have a username and password that needs to be provided in order to connect to that database and get information from it. So this is the username and password that you'll set up here that WordPress will use in order to connect to your database. So you choose a username, a database, and create a user. And then below there, you assign a particular user access rights to the database that you've created. And then you choose what privileges you want to allow that user. So there's a whole bunch of different things, a whole bunch of different privileges that a user might have in terms of administering a database. So they might just be able to read the data. They also might be able to edit, modify, delete it. WordPress requires all of those privileges because it is going to do all of those things. If you delete a post, it needs to be able to delete those records in the database. So just make sure that you give that WordPress user login that you've created all the privileges for interacting with the database. Click Make Changes, and then your database is set up. You should also then get a URL, which is a URL to the database server, which you can put in along with the username and password you created when you're configuring WordPress. Again, we'll look at this in more detail in the tutes. And the third part is basically tying those two things together, tying the files that you put on your web server to the SQL database that you just created. So in the WordPress installation, there'll be a file called wp-config.php. This is a sample config file, and basically what you need to do is modify that file with the database information that we just created, and then save it and re-upload it as wp-config.php, so without the sample part. And then that's the file that WordPress automatically looks for that kind of information to find the URL to your database and also the username and the login so that it can start accessing and modifying the database that you've created. So this is what it looks like, the wp-config WordPress file. It's a whole bunch of stuff, but basically those 4 parts there that I've highlighted are the ones that you need to modify. So the database name, which you gave it in the cPanel, you put in the username, password, and the host name as well. Now, if you're not given a specific host name, then usually you can leave it as localhost, but if they've told you that there's a specific URL for the database server, then you put that in there. If you can't find that or you don't have that, first thing would be to try localhost and see if that works. So we make those modifications, save it, re-upload it as wp-config.php, and then basically you go to your website URL and load, and it should load some, this screen here, installation screen. So by the time you see this, WordPress is up and running. It's managing to connect to your database, and all you do now is give it some information. Things like the site title, but the most important thing here is that you create a user account for WordPress. So WordPress requires at least one user account for you to log into the backend and start creating, modifying content. We don't want just any of the general public being able to modify the website. So obviously you're going to need some form of login, and that's what you create here. Then you hit the install button, and then that's basically the installation process complete. You can start then using your WordPress site. So I'll just talk briefly about the different WordPress interfaces. You can basically break them down into what I'll either refer to as the admin interfaces and the public interfaces, or I might also call them the backend and the front-end interfaces. So the admin or backend interface looks like this. I'm sure most of you have actually used WordPress before and are familiar with what this looks like. But in the context of a content management system, this should now make even more sense. So this is the admin or the backend interface, which requires you as a site administrator to log into in order to create and manage the content. So that's why we needed to create that login. So this is where you do all of your content management, for example, editing posts, moderating comments, installing plugins and themes, and managing user accounts and a bunch of other stuff. So as I said, it requires a login, which you set up during the installation. And that interface is accessible at your website URL and then /wp-admin. Yep.
Are we allowed to use WordPress themes or not?
Uh,
Can you get marked down because it's an easy thing to do? It's not really designed web pages.
Yeah, for the assignment, we'll get you to create your own from scratch. I guess the only exception I'd probably make is if you wanted to start from, I guess, one of the really basic themes that's just designed to have typography and stuff. Yeah. But if you do want to do that, I'd say definitely discuss it with your tutor first. But yeah, the preferred thing to do is to do it from scratch. Yeah. Just because that way you learn more, I guess. Okay, so yeah, accessible at that website. So your website URL, whatever the WordPress directory is, then /wp-admin. That's how you access that interface. If you're not logged in, it will redirect you to the login page. You log in and then you get the admin section. So there's a URL to more documentation on the admin screens. And they're the ones that you'll spend most of your time in, configuring and managing the content in your site. So this is the public or front-end interface, is basically your website as the public sees it when it goes to your URL. So this is what comes up by default if you go to www.whateveryourwebsiteis.com. And it displays the content as your theme determines how it should be output. Okay, so as I said, this is what the visitors go to the site will see when they go to your URL. But you will, when you're developing your theme and when you're adding content, you want to go back and forth between these interfaces quite a lot in order to check that the content you've updated appears as you've envisioned it in the public or the front-end interface. All right, so WordPress themes. So WordPress, like most all other CMSs, can install themes to change the look and feel of the site. So this is one of the great advantages of storing our content separately to our look and feel information, is that we can have the same content and we can easily apply a different theme to adjust the layout and all these other sorts of things. So that URL there is a link to the page where you can browse various pre-made themes. So as a good starting point, it might be useful to install a bunch of different themes that are pre-made and see how, when you activate them, it's the same content, but just it shows you what a theme can change about the site and what remains the same. So as we were just kind of talking about, your first assignment is going to be to create your own WordPress theme from scratch which uniquely services the content and purpose of your site, which in your case is going to be a portfolio site. Okay, so this is the one of the admin interfaces of WordPress where you can select and manage, activate, deactivate, and install new themes. So as I said, it might be a good idea as one of the initial things that you do, go through and add a couple more themes and see how they change how your site displays. Now the themes, of course, only affect the public front-end interface. They don't affect the back-end interface. This is the WordPress themes directory. So this is a place where, it's not the only place where you can get them, but this is basically WordPress's central directory of pre-made themes that people have made available to share. And as you can see, there's a lot of them, over 1,400. And that only includes the ones here. There's also other ones that people might release on their own websites. And I believe these only cover the free themes as well. So there's plenty of commercially made themes as well. But all the ones on this site are all free. And installing another theme and inspecting the code with Firebug is often a really good way to figure out if another theme has done something which you really like, to figure out how they did that and then maybe implement something similar in your theme. Okay, so not that this is relevant to your assignment because you have to create your own theme, but on any other web design project, one of the first things if you're creating a WordPress site, you're going to ask yourself is, well, should I just install a pre-made theme, or should I go and create a new one? Or should I go somewhere in the middle where I install a base theme which has a license that allows me to modify it freely and make some modifications? So there are, of course, some advantages to using pre-made themes. They're a quick and easy approach. There's plenty of well-made free themes, as we've seen, and you can modify existing themes to suit your own needs to some extent. There are some disadvantages. Obviously, they're going to be less unique, especially if it's a very popular theme. If it appears, in the popular themes on that theme directory, then you can guarantee that there's, several hundred other websites out there that are using that same theme. So if you're looking for a really unique branding for your website, then this may not necessarily do that for you. And they're generic. So they're not made with any specific content in mind. So that's a big thing to consider. They're never going to suit your specific unique content as well as a theme that you make yourself. And depending on how much customization you do end up doing, you might find that it actually takes longer to customize another theme or modify another theme than it does to create your own new theme from scratch. So creating your own theme from scratch, there are some disadvantages. It takes longer. Obviously, you have to do all the work yourself. And you have to learn how to do it. Okay? So you have to learn some new processes and some new technologies. The advantages are that you have the potential to create a completely unique look and feel for the site. It's completely flexible and customizable. You have complete control over it. So there's no waste of resources if you're only creating functionality that you actually are going to use. And an advantage, just as it may be a disadvantage, is that you get to learn a new skill. You get to learn how to make themes, which you can then apply to other web design projects. All right, so this is starting to get a little bit more into what we're going to look in the tutorials, but I'll go through again on a fairly overview level the anatomy of a WordPress theme. So this gets down to the nuts and bolts of developing our own WordPress theme. So WordPress themes are all contained within their own directories, and they're installed to a directory within the WordPress installation called wp-config. And then under that you'll find a folder called themes. So you can see in this example from one of my web servers a WordPress installation there's a themes folder, and I've got 3 themes installed there, 2011, 2010, and Typo Minima, my 3 themes. I don't know if there's an upper limit to the number of themes that you can install, but if there is, I haven't reached it yet. Okay, so a WordPress theme consists of a collection of PHP files, as well as one or more CSS files and associated resources. So the images that you use, any JavaScript files, all of that kind of stuff. So there you can see is looking at one of those theme folders, 2011. See a bunch of different PHP files. This is a particularly large theme, so when you're creating your theme, there won't necessarily be anywhere near as many files as this, and we'll look in more detail later at what these different files do. But you can see there's basically all the resources, both HTML, CSS, PHP, JavaScript, images, anything that goes into the creation of the look and feel of the site. Okay, now, so within each PHP file, you'll find that they contain HTML markup interspersed with PHP snippets. And these PHP snippets are designed to generally retrieve some information from the database that WordPress has put in there and then output them inside of the HTML. So this is our dynamic part of the code. So you can see this generally looks like a normal, so this is a header.php file, which is designed just to output the header of your site in this theme. And you see it looks like a fairly normal HTML file. We've got the doc type and the HTML elements. But interspersed within this are these little bits of PHP, which we'll look at a bit more in the tutorials. But you can see there's these things called language attributes, blog info, another blog info with a different parameter. So they're what WordPress calls template tags, which are essentially, those will all be replaced with HTML, which is generated by the PHP script by going and getting information from the database. So these, WordPress calls these template tags. So WordPress uses its own PHP functions called template tags to output information to the page. And so, for example, you'll see on the next slide that there's a template tag called blog info, which is used to get the name of the site from the database and output it within the title HTML element. And so these functions save us from writing a lot of our own PHP code. So while PHP might seem a bit scary, you'll actually find that there's really very little PHP that you have to write in order to create a basic WordPress theme. So this is that example again. This is another snippet from a header.php file, and you'll see that again it looks like a normal HTML file, but you'll see up here there's the title attribute inside the head element of my HTML document. So that's where whatever goes in there shows up in the title bar of the browser. And in this case, rather than just writing it out, so let's say the website's called, well, down here you can see it's called Dave's KIB216 blog. So rather than writing that in there directly, because you can modify this information in the WordPress admin interfaces, you can go into the settings and change the site name there. So if I was just to hard code that in and I wanted to change the site name, I'd have to go back into the PHP file and change it there. But if the person who's actually going to be using the website, they're not necessarily going to want to go in and modify code, and we're not necessarily going to want them to either, because chances are they'll probably break it. So there's admin interfaces that allow us to change various settings of the WordPress site. In this example, we can go into settings and there's just a text field where we can type in what we want to call the name of our blog. And so that's why we use this template tag here called blog info and then pass it this value called name. And WordPress has a function somewhere in its core code called blog info, which will accept that parameter and then go, okay, I'm going to go to the database now and pull out whatever is being stored as the blog name and then output it here. Basically, this PHP here will be replaced with whatever that blog name is as stored in the database. So you can see in a comparison between these two pictures, this is what the code looks like in my PHP file. But once I go to my web browser and I load up the page and I view the source, you can see that the HTML code is all the same, but each of these PHP blocks have been replaced with normal HTML. So this is really one of the most fundamentally important things to understand, is that there's PHP in the PHP files, but by the time it gets to the web browser, it's just seeing HTML. And the PHP tags have been replaced by whatever is being generated by that PHP. In this case, it's outputting the title of the site. So where do we find out what data WordPress can retrieve and what PHP code or what WordPress template tags retrieve it? First place to look is the WordPress codex, which is what WordPress calls its documentation pages. So there's two links there, one to template tags and one to function references. So they're similar, but they have slightly definitions for them, but they're effectively very, very similar things, template tags and functions. So this, for example, is the template tags documentation, and we can see a whole bunch of them listed here. And if I click on one of them, it shows me how to use it, and it tells me what it does, it tells me what parameters I can pass it. All right, and it gives me a whole heap of example code. So again, really good documentation. You just kind of need to know where to look. So that's the first place to look. Another good thing to do is look at other themes. Okay, so if you're working on a particular template file, find another theme, look at how they've done it, look at the template tags that they've used to output certain things, and then use the same template tags in your WordPress theme. And then, of course, you can Google it as well. So even when I was creating this example on the previous page, I'm not necessarily going to remember off the top of my head all of these template tags. So what I did was I Googled WordPress display blog name, for example, here on this link. All right, and the first link, logically enough, is going to take me to that same documentation page for blog info and show me how to display the name of the site. So they're the three main ways I would suggest looking into exactly what WordPress can output within your theme and how to do it. And there's a whole heap of them. Okay, so moving on to how a WordPress theme is structured. Generally, if we look at the page structure, WordPress theme is structured in a similar way. So if we look at a page, there's generally a header section, a content section, some other content sections. We might have a sidebar, we might have a search form, we might have a footer. So all these different logical sections of the page are divided up into different PHP files. And this goes to this point of modularization. And modularization meaning rather than having repeated code that we have to put in all these different pages, if we've got similar code, why don't we just pull it out and put it in one file, and then when we need it in any of these other pages, we just include it in those. So the easiest example of that is the header. If we're going to have 10 pages, rather than writing the header manually on each page, let's separate that out into its own file called header.php, and then in any page where we want to use that, we'll just include that in that particular template. So, as this example says here, this is the template tag to do exactly that, PHP get header. That will, wherever we put that in any template, we'll go and look for a file called header.php and put that code and replace it where this PHP code was there. So this is what those particular template files refer to when you map them logically to the page structure. There's the header section, the content, which is usually divided up into the post. There might be navigation. A search form usually gets its own template file. sidebar will get its own template file, and a footer will usually get its own template file as well. Now this is flexible. You can sort of modify this process a bit, but that's generally the way that it's done. So this example here is how 3 separate files here, header.php, sidebar.php, and footer.php, are all separated out and then included in the main index.php. So index.php represents, in terms of the template, your home page. And you could, if you want, just put all of the code in that index.php. But what we'll look at in the tutorials is we're going to separate out some of that code so that we can have these separate modular template files, which we can then include into the index file. And what that means is if we have another template file for, let's say, a single post page, then that also we're going to want to have the header, and we're going to want to have the footer, and we might want to have the sidebar. So rather than writing all of that again in the single post page, we again can just include them with one line of PHP. So again, we'll look at that in much more detail in the tutes. This just here is a link to where I've got these screenshots from a very good step-by-step tutorial on creating a WordPress theme. We'll actually be looking at that in the tutes as well. Okay, so this is another template, default template for a single post, single.php, and as you can see, again, split up then even into more single modular blocks. Again, we'll look at that more in the tutorials. But one thing to note is that as there are conventions when it goes to creating these themes, and basically WordPress expects to have your template files named a certain way. So for example, your header section, or when you use this PHP code get header here, what WordPress is going to do is it's going to look in your themes directory, your current themes directory, for a file called header.php. So if you haven't called it header.php, it's not going to find it. So again, you can find those particular file names that it's expecting in the documentation, and again, we'll go over them more in the tutes. But there is a naming convention to the template files that you need to be aware of. Now this rather large diagram, which you probably can't really read from here, but I've linked it again to the WordPress documentation, is to demonstrate how WordPress looks for particular template files. Now you don't actually have to implement the entire template hierarchy. If you want, all you really need to implement is just one index.php file, and a theme will work with just a single index.php file. But what this demonstrates is that when you're requesting a page from WordPress, it goes through a certain hierarchy of template files that it looks for before finally settling on the default one of index.php. If none of these other ones exist, it doesn't matter what content you request from WordPress, it will always default back to index.php. So that's why you can have a WordPress theme that just has that one single file. But if, for example, we click a link which is to a particular category, then it's going to look for a file called category.php. We could also extend that so that if we want a particular specific category, so a category with a particular name, then we'll create a template file called category hyphen and then the category name.php. So we'll look for that first. If it can't find that, we'll look for the generic category template, and then if it can't find that, it will just load the index template. So that might be useful a little bit further on down the track when you're looking at expanding your template from just one or two different pages to various different layouts. Okay, but the point is that you can use as much or as little of the template hierarchy as your site requires. So as I said, you can get away with creating a WordPress theme that only has essentially that index.php file and a CSS file. So we'll just quickly, and this is the last little bit, so we don't have that much longer. We'll quickly look at some of the most common template files that you will create. And so this will give you the exact names that they're expecting. The first one is header.php. It usually contains the doc type, metadata, and head section of the HTML document. So basically that first part of your HTML page, which is consistent across every page, is generally put in the header.php file. And it may also contain your top navigation, if that also is consistent across all of your pages. So once you've got that header.php file, you can include that header in other template files to avoid duplicating the code it contains with that template tag there, get_header. Footer.php is very similar to header.php, except it will probably be even more simple, and it's usually just whatever is consistently in the footer across all of your different pages. And similarly, you can include that within any other file using get_footer. Sidebar.php, again, is basically whatever you want to have as a sidebar. And again, that sidebar is likely to appear across multiple different pages in your site. So again, in sidebar.php, we usually put whatever is going to consistently be in that sidebar. And quite often the things that contain is some sort of navigation, either primary or secondary navigation, links, a search form can be included in the sidebar, and also, as we'll see a little bit further on, widgetized plugins that can be added and removed through the administrator interface. And I think this is the next slide, details that a bit more. And again, you'll see similarly, a similar naming convention to the header and footer, get_sidebar. The difference being that this one, you can pass it the name of a particular sidebar. So if you have multiple sidebars, you can name them differently and you can tell it to include a particular sidebar in a page. So this is what I mean by widgetized plugins. Again, as a way of giving a user of the site control over the content, it's common to create what's known as a widgetized sidebar. And again, we'll look at that more a bit later, but what it means is you can, if you have a widgetized sidebar, you can go into this admin interface where you can customize the widgets, and you can see that you can basically using drag and drop, just select if you want certain little widgets in the sidebar. So this example has a calendar, a search form, and a listing of recent posts. And these widgets are usually plugins that you will install. So again, we'll look at that in more detail in the tutes. But that's, I guess that's something unique about the sidebar, in that you can make it a region where the person using the admin interfaces can actually customize what's in there without having to go and modify the template code. Okay, the content section. So this is the main section of the web page where the posts usually will be output. And WordPress, of course, has two main content types, a post and a page. So posts are designed to be smaller, and designed to display multiple posts on one logical page, whereas a page is meant to be one page shows on one logical page. Now there's three main template files associated with displaying these, and they are single.php, page.php, and index.php. So index.php is the one that we'll start with, and as I said, this is generally always the first file that you'll create, and it's the only one that's absolutely required in a WordPress theme. And index, being called index.php, it's going to be the one that loads by default. And so it's the default front page, and it doesn't have to, but it usually displays excerpts of your most recent posts. So by default, on the default theme installation, that's what it will do. It will display a blog. And it uses it uses a special code construct called the WordPress loop to output the posts. And we'll look at that again in more detail in the tutorials. And the index file usually includes the header, footer, and sidebar templates. So usually what we do is we divide them out and then include them back in. But if you just had it as one page, technically you don't need to do that. Single.php is the template that WordPress will try and load first if you click on the title of a post and so you expand just that single post. So it displays the entire contents of a single post. It may also display comments if enabled, and again it usually includes the header and footer template files. Page.php displays the contents of a WordPress page content item as opposed to a post. It also may display comments if enabled, and again usually includes the header and footer template files. Okay, so they're the ones that we'll probably look at today, at least in class, but then there's some more that we'll end up looking at. Categories.php is the file that it will look for if you click on a link to a category. So if you've used WordPress before, which I think most of you have, you'll know that you can categorize your different posts. So you can click on a link to a category which usually will display just posts from that category. And in order to do that, WordPress will look for this categories.php template file. And you can combine that with navigation is usually a way of doing that. So this example down the bottom is from Smash Magazine, where as part of their navigation, this top line in bold is linked to their different categories. So they've got posts on, say, graphics, inspiration, coding, and design. Each one of those will link to a different category page, and then only display posts that have been in those categories. Another interesting thing that they've done with this one is below that they've got what look like subcategories, but they've actually used these as tags. So WordPress supports categories and tagging, which is similar, but tagging you can posts across multiple categories can have the same tag. So slightly different things, but again we'll look into that more in the classes. The other template file that you'll see commonly is functions.php, and this is different to most other ones. Most of the other template files in that there's no particular page that you'll go to which will display the functions.php template. Really what the functions.php file is for is purely for putting other bits of PHP, other functionality in it that you'll reference commonly from other template files, but don't necessarily display any page on their own. So as I say here, it's simply a place to store any reusable functions that can be used by any other template files. So that's a fairly brief overview. For a more detailed and complete list of template files, you can see the WordPress codex, especially these links that are provided here. And there's some of the links that we'll be looking at during the tutorials. And that's where I've gotten a lot of the information from those previous slides. And for a complete list of WordPress functions and template tags, those two links, again, they're function reference and template tags. Okay, a quick word on navigation menus. There's a template tag called WP list pages and WP list categories, which will output a list of links that can be styled like any other list-based navigation menu. So this is an important reason in last week's exercise that I got you to create your navigation structure as linked lists. So when it comes to WordPress, WordPress will output your navigation